Have you seen me dice bag? The Grognard Files.
Hello, my name is Dirk the Dice, and this is the Grognard Files podcast, talking bobbins about tabletop RPGs from back in the day. This is the third part of episode 6, which is all about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It's a supplement, or more accurately, a bestiary, or beastery, however you say it, because we're giving this the title of Monster Manual, talking about creatures, beasts and monstrosities that populate the worlds of D&D. Dungeons & Dragons has brought new listeners to the Grognard Files, which is great. Hello to you all. And some have taken to iTunes to give stars and a review. You remember iTunes? You know that thing where you used to buy things but you never actually owned them? Well, people like Woodscanner have given a review like this. I started playing a little earlier than these guys, but it's like listening to me and my mates talking after the game. Only you know they're northern, and no one's been drinking beer, and you can't argue with them, and when they get something very important wrong. Thanks for giving the review, Woodscanner. It makes us sound like two Methodists arguing in a pub over nothing. In this part of the podcast, it includes @Daily Dwarf from Twitter, picking fiends that first appeared in the pages of White Dwarf during its August period in the early to mid-80s. He's written a great piece that I'll read in my usual nasally tone, and he almost got me to include the pluck, but he realised that it was actually a race from Traveller that appeared in issue 47. So I had a lucky escape there. And Blythy also joins me in the role-playing room of Rambling to open the box on the 5th edition D&D that we've been playing in the past few weeks. Later on, we're also together to face off each other with our wandering monster tables behind the Games Master screen. I should say that I love monsters. Back in the day when Simon eventually got the other books, after we had been struggling for a while with just the Dungeon Master's Guide, Blythy would have his nose in the Player's Handbook, studying the spells, and I would be endlessly flicking through the Monster Manual. I never put my nose in it, though, because it smells really bad, like sour milk. Now, I have to say that, in my opinion, I'm a better games master than a player, so I instinctively was drawn to the descriptions and special features, because I think directing monsters is part of the thrill and wonder of playing role-playing games. And I'll talk a bit later in the podcast about how there is relatively little discussion in podcasts about monsters. And I'd like to see more. And when it comes to monsters, I really believe that they shouldn't be set dressing. They should be directed like Spielberg directs monsters. I'm paraphrasing Hitchcock here, but there's no thrill in encountering a monster, just the anticipation of it. But something went a bit awry after we awoke from our deep freeze and was slightly thawed out in the noughties, and we were playing D&D quite intensely. I became a bit insane, and a bit of a flavour of that comes out later in the podcast. But we'll get on to that later. I'm wandering down passages of thought and rambling like a lost beholder. So let's get going. Ramblers, let's get rambling.
Open box!
We've opened the box several times in this episode to reveal our checkered past with Dungeons & Dragons. I've got Blythy with me. Hello, Blythy.
Hello, Dirk.
We've got together for one last job. Open box is our memories and the first encounters of a game, how we played, and general thoughts and first impressions seen through rose-tinted glasses. For this one, Blythy, I want you to cast your mind right back to about 12 weeks ago.
That far back?
Yeah, can you do that?
No, I can remember 12 years ago, but 12 weeks is...
It's going to be a struggle.
Yeah, at our age, that's what happens, isn't it? You know.
Yeah, 12 weeks is a bit of a blind spot, isn't it? And what we did 12 weeks ago is we started to play online, didn't we? We were joined by Daily Dwarf and Joe from our travel adventure game.
Yeah.
And we started playing online and started to open the box. And it is a box because I managed to get the starter set from Waterstones, which is a book chain in the UK. And I thought, I'll give it a go. Let's see what it's like. And it is a starter set. It's not the basic set. You can download the basic rules from the Wizard of Course.
Which is what I did. I downloaded the basic rules, which are free.
Yeah.
Like drug dealers, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
Giving you a free one to get you hooked.
Yeah. What they do with the starter set is that you get an adventure, and they give you the rules to play the adventures. Mines of Fandelver, and this appeared in 2014. And Wizard of Course had extensively playtested what was called D&D Next. And this was the first appearance of what is known as 5th edition now, isn't it? You have to say that you can feel the playtesting. Now, we have to say, don't we, that, of course, we missed 3 and 4.
Yes, we did. We don't really have any real knowledge of that. I think the only experience I've had of that is limited, because it involves flicking through it in a bookshop. I don't know if it was 3rd edition or 4th edition D&D. I can remember flicking through it, might have been Player's Handbook, and feeling quite sort of kind of recoiled at the thought of it, because it looked incredibly dense and complex. And I think we had a discussion afterwards where I said to you, do you know what, I think I'm too old to learn a new game. I think that's
yes,
it.
That's right.
I'm too old, because I looked at it and just thought, and I might be wrong, maybe it's not particularly complicated. I mean, it's still D&D, isn't it? But it seemed a bit dense and a bit different and a bit too much, where you think, oh no, I'm just going to stick to old stuff now. That's it.
I think that's part of the joy of this starter set, because clearly this is pitched at new players, getting new players in there, but also old players, isn't it? So you'll get the 40-something guys who going into Waterstones, see that and they say, "Oh, I'll give it a try." For 15 quid. I paid a lot less than that, actually. And the adventure in those very atmospheric. But the thing that strikes you first of all is that thing. It's simple, isn't it? It somehow kind of cut through some of those complexities in detail.
It does. What I think's impressive about the 5th edition, because let's face it, the drug dealer tactic worked, didn't it? And we have all bought the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual, so it did work. The free, well done, Wizards of the Coast.
Well, I think because I was Games Master in the game, I think I deserve some kind of commission.
I think you should, yeah.
Because
by my a lot of sales, haven't they?
Yeah.
You've bought it, I've bought it.
Yeah, everybody's bought it.
Ed's bought it. Joel's bought it.
Yeah.
Nearly everyone.
We all bought it.
It's a wonderful marketing technique.
Yeah.
Let's say games designers everywhere give away a basic version of the game for free, and people are going, if it's good, people are going to buy the rest of it.
By my reckoning, that's 360 quid. I must produce some of that.
I think you must produce some of that back. Yeah. But you're right. We bought that, and it is a very, very well put together rule book. There is only one glitch, and Daily Dwarf will back me up on this. Having all the spells in some straightforward alphabetical order is annoying. Yeah. If you're listening, Wizards of the Coast, that is annoying. It should be broken down into levels and then alphabetically, because there's no point looking through it alphabetically and finding power word kill under P when you first level. This is irrelevant. You can't have it. But it is a very well written rule book, I think. It's very engaging as a rule book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Player's Handbook, very engaging, quite simple, straightforward. There's a lot of colour. It retains a lot of the original game, but cuts out a lot of the nonsense, a lot of the kind of inconsistent rules, and weird tables and some of the stupid stuff that always got on our nerves. So it's a very well written rulebook and very easy to kind of get to grips with. You know?
Well, I think that's what I liked about the starter set rules is that it's quite a flimsy booklet that you get with it, and it just gives you enough to play Mines of Fandelver, and it takes you from 1st to 5th level. You get pre-generated characters, so none of the character creation stuff's in there. It just gives you what you need to play the game,
and that's quite good that you get the pre-generated ones, because all the kind of little feats and extra things that they can do are all there ready for you, and it explains them so you can get to grips with it. It's interesting, isn't it, that we've talked about some new games through these podcasts. We've talked about RuneQuest 6. We've talked about other games. We recently played Night's Black Agents, and there's a lot of games out there. And I think we've said before, sometimes I defy people who've never played a role-playing game to play these games. I defy someone who's never experienced a role-playing game to play RuneQuest 6, because it is a very dense game. It's brilliant if you're experienced, but it's very dense and hard to get to grips with. And if you've no experience of a role-playing game, it would be impenetrable. But 5th edition D&D, they do a brilliant job of, actually, if you've never played a role-playing game, I think you could read that and get to grips with it. And that's a good thing, isn't it?
It is a good thing.
As we get older and all die off, where are the next role-playing generation coming from? As all our hit points drain away through old age. And
we don't believe in resurrection. So.
We don't believe in resurrection, so we can't come back.
And I think you said early on when we started this off, we mentioned briefly D&D 5th edition, and you said this is a game that you always wanted it to be.
Yes, it is. It does feel like, as we've discussed through these D&D podcasts, when we played back in the day, I was always the one who sort of was most sympathetic to D&D, despite all its problems. And 5th edition is very much like what I imagined and wanted D&D to be 30 years ago. But D&D sort of wasn't, because it was a bit crunchy and a bit clumsy and a bit weird in places. But it does, it's a bit like remarrying your ex-partner and finding out, that they're okay really after all, and they've changed.
Well, I'm going to suggest that actually it's probably a perfect game for our group, because it's got elements in it that suit our style. So first off, it's nostalgic, because it even though it's got innovations, it's still recognisable as D&D.
It is still recognisable, yeah. So if you wanted to play a paladin, for example, it is like a paladin from 1st edition. If you want to play a magic user, the same spells are in there. There's the same sense of what the game used to be. They don't abandon that.
Although it's been pointed out, Enlarge has been tampered with.
It's been tampered with, isn't it?
Yeah. You have to have a saving throw. So it's nostalgic. It feels like D&D. It feels like you're in a D&D game. However, it's not as adversarial as old D&D. So the theme of us this episode has been about the power game element.
Yeah.
So we've played Mines of Fandelver. We've played another game with the old scroats in Southport.
Yes.
More of which in the next part of this podcast. But we've played it with different players, and it feels like it engenders more cooperative play than we've been used to in the past. I don't know what that's down to.
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? I think part of it, though, I think part of it is that if you read the Player's Handbook, the 5th edition Player's Handbook, it has a few little bits in there about motivations of characters, backgrounds of characters, and the descriptions of the character classes are less about, whilst it does include what they can do, how many hit points they get, and what advantages and disadvantages. So it obviously includes the crunchy game side of it, but it also gives a kind of description of what that character class is about, what the motivations are. A good example, brilliant example is, and I really like this character class, is the Warlock. So there's 3 types of wizard, not just one in 5th edition. There's sorcerers, there's wizards, and there's warlocks. And a warlock gets their magic from bargaining with some kind of terrible, supreme demon or force. So it gives some examples, like, kind of like a pact with the devil almost. So you get your magic from a pact with the devil. But that's an interesting development, isn't it, for D&D? Because what it's really saying is this character's power, if you like. So you can be a power gamer and be a warlock, but that power's kind of tempered a little, and there's a negotiation there, and there's something behind it that's a little bit more than a load of numbers on a character sheet. I think the thing with D&D first edition, you always got this thing that it was just a load of numbers on a character sheet, and it was about cranking up the hit points and cranking up the to hit rolls and the damage bonuses and all that. And whilst that's still there in 5th edition, but there's things that sit behind that, and I think that Warlock's a great example. Yes, you're a powerful wizard, but you're getting that power from some strange evil, not necessarily evil. It gives a couple of evil examples, one that's not evil, but you're getting it from some kind of deity or something, or some supernatural force, and that's interesting. That offsets, I think, that power gamer dimension.
Yeah, it does. So there's that, isn't it? And you really brought me on to my third thing that I think is good about it, and that's about character and about the character classes, and the amount of effort they've put into that player's handbook is more or less taken up in generating your character. And it's pulling on those strings that we like in a game. So building up a character based on your motivations, your passions, what you drives you, why you're doing this. Very, very nicely done, and a lot of contextual stuff to really give you an idea of a race or a character class. I think that's really well done.
And I think as well what it does to offset power gaming is from a practical sort of rules point of view, your characters are quite good. It doesn't give you don't end up with a first level character who's going to die if he has a bad sneezing fit or something like that. Whereas in first edition there was always that sense of you got 3 hit points, and a first level thief with 3 hit points, and God, if you stub your toe, you're dead.
Well, they've kind of achieved balance, because I've always had this view that D&D has been compromised by its need to have balance, but they've achieved balance. But they've achieved balance not by penalising character classes, but actually enhancing them and bringing them to a level where it's you can survive.
The balance is more about what you're good at than what you're not good at.
Exactly,
that's very true, I think. And it's like some of the statistics, the stat benefits of strength, dexterity and what have you, they're not set at that ridiculously high level. So I know in a previous podcast we talked about, the fighter who always felt you had to have strength 18 because there was no point. But in this, you can be a fighter with a strength of 13 and still be fairly tough and be good at being a fighter. So that min-maxing thing's kind of gone out the window as well. It doesn't matter as much if you've got a lowish stat or a high stat. It doesn't give you a massive benefit over and above anything else. So I think that's an interesting aspect of it. And I think as well the character classes they're just more interesting. I mean, we've said before, I always like to play. In first edition D&D, I always like to play the magic user. I'm not interested in being a cleric for obvious reasons. I've never been interested in being a fighter, because I think a fighter's a bit boring. You just hit things till they stop moving, or you stop moving. Either way, it's boring. And I think in 5th edition, I read those character classes and thought, actually, do you know what? I wouldn't mind playing a fighter because they're quite interesting. They have different abilities and different things they can do, and you think, when we've been playing online, Joe's character, who's a fighter, who's just a regular fighter, I actually think, it's quite a good character class, isn't it? He's got some feats and special abilities that make him seem like a bit of a tough guy with a sword, who's a bit better than a regular person with a sword, and that's a really good thing, I think.
Some of those feats and special features are really good, aren't they? I mean, we really like Eddie's character is Roscoe Tossbottle, which is going to be one of the best names. I think. He's a halfling rogue, and because of his racial characteristic, he's naturally lucky. So that means that if he rolls a 1, he can roll again. And rolling 2 ones in a row is impossible. Turns out it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing is, Roscoe Tossbottle, Halfling Thief, is a very lucky character. Sadly, Eddie isn't. That's one of the dilemmas of role-playing, isn't it? With his dice roll. He hasn't been that lucky. That's one of the problems.
But it's those little features and character elements, as well as the background and personality bits, that make it really interesting, I think.
I think another thing it does, and this will shock the listening public in the podcast sphere, podcast verse, whatever it is out there. It actually makes clerics okay. I won't say interesting, I'll say okay. I actually think.
Well, I think that comes down to, because I remember when we first started playing, I mean, this might reflect our age, but we spent, as grognards, we started talking about having a rest, didn't we? And the rules for having a rest.
Yes. Yeah.
And we spent a good 20 minutes about how good the having a rest
having a rest rule is great in 5th edition. Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the cleric interesting, isn't it? Cause
it does, because with 5th edition, in 1st edition, once you lost hit points, it was very hard to get back through healing. Natural healing was quite a slow process. So you always needed healing potions, and you needed a cleric who had cure light wounds and cure serious wounds and that kind of thing. And that's really what made clerics boring, because the cleric always had to stock up on healing spells, and essentially was just some kind of glorified St. John's ambulance after the fighting was over, and that's what made them boring. But in 5th edition, you're right, you get hit points back far quicker by resting. For an hour you can get some hit points back. A night's sleep you can get hit points back, and that means that the cleric doesn't have to worry about having healing spells or as many healing spells, and can actually have some of the more interesting spells. So that's a good thing. We've played, and I think the Daily Dwarf is the cleric. He got the short straw.
Playing a dwarf.
Playing a dwarven cleric, yeah. But I think he's only used, in 2 sessions, he's only used 1 healing spell, hasn't he?
Yes.
On someone who got hit with a very nasty weapon, and he needed it because he was at death's door. The rest of us haven't needed healing spells, and I think that's good. It makes clerics more interesting. Who'd have thought it?
Yeah,
perhaps that's its greatest achievement from my point of view. It's made. I'm not saying I want to play one. I won't go that far, but they are slightly more interested.
Well, you could also say, who'd have thought it? When we started doing these podcasts and we started playing, who'd have thought it would say that actually D&D could be our game?
Could be the future.
Could be the game that we've been waiting for. And
and it's an interesting point, that, isn't it? Because it makes you wonder, doesn't it, about games. That's a big philosophical point here.
Hang on.
It's just a
deep, don't need to lie down.
You might need to lie down after this. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it, about the games you play, the role-playing games you play, and the life you lead. So when we were younger, we had all the time in the world, and we played a lot of RuneQuest. And it was okay, that, because we could invent our own scenarios. And the fact that a RuneQuest NPC is quite difficult to generate, the monsters are difficult to generate because you have all the hit locations, you have all the percentage chances, all that kind of stuff. That was all right. Now we're older, we've got families and jobs and responsibilities. We like to capitalise on time for role-playing, for actually playing the game. We have less time to kind of prepare stuff, don't we?
Yeah.
So the games that we've started to enjoy, we've played Numenera. That's quite easy to run. It's quite easy to make stuff up on the hoof. Knights Black Agents, we've played that. Although that's we'll talk about that at some point in a podcast. But again, it has that kind of improvisationary feel to it, doesn't it? Yeah. And 5th edition D&D has the same thing. It's easy to prepare for, and kind of quick to play, and quick to kind of get into the action and move the plot along. So maybe it's less about the games themselves and more about your lifestyle. Maybe one day when we're old men in old people's home with all the time in the world, we'll revert back to RuneQuest.
Yeah. And Aftermath.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to come back, Blythy, and I hope you've got your wandering monster table ready, because we're going to talk monsters. But for now, see you later.
See ya.
The White Dwarf.
Dungeons and Dragons, the Fiend Factory. Monsters? You want 'em? Well, White Dwarf had 'em in buckets. From the very beginning of D&D, there was an insatiable appetite for monsters. I think it's easy to see why, if you consider the wargaming roots of RPGs. It was the weird and wonderful fantastical beasts in Gary Gygax's fantasy supplement for Chainmail that made it so distinctive and set it apart from the other commercial wargame rules available. Dragons, orcs, trolls, giants. The medieval purists were aghast, but the young Turks of the gaming scene were eager for more, and as D&D emerged in its own right, the monsters remained a defining feature of the game. Drawing from myth, legend and fiction, monsters were a key element in the worlds and adventures created by those early dungeon masters, allowing those stories and legends to become more vividly alive at the tabletop. But it seemed, however many monsters were available for the game, there was always a desire for more. Those pesky players kept reading the rule books and finding the monsters' strengths and weaknesses. TSR's answer? Well, more supplements. The very first D&D supplements, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Eldritch Wizardry, all included new creatures that DMs could use to confuse and test their players. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first AD&D rulebook published was the Monster Manual. Basically, we all just love monsters. And from its earliest issues, White Dwarf wasn't immune from this monster mania. It seems alliteration is obligatory in D&D Monsterland, as we'll see. It all started way back in issue 4 with Monsters Mild and Malign, edited by the Scourge of Necromancers Everywhere, Mr. Don Turnbull. This issue and the next just featured creatures already published in other magazines, notably from the Dungeoneer and Alarms and Excursions. Readers' contributions were encouraged for future issues. I should say that none of the many that I sent were ever published, but I'll magnanimously carry on anyway. I'm over it. Really. And so, in issue 6, Monsters Mild and Malign became The Fiend Factory. A much better title. After all, who wants mild monsters? Each entry followed the now well-established format for D&D monster write-up. A stat block, a description, an accompanying illustration. More on these in a bit. During his time as editor of the column, Don Turnbull also added his own comments on each monster. These were usually quite instructive, with thoughts on how the Dungeon Master could best use the creature in the game. And, of course, Don Turnbull, being Don Turnbull, he also gave the monster mark for each entry in the Fiend Factory, mainly because he was the only person in Britain who knew how to calculate the value. The Fiend Factory quickly went from strength to strength in the early years of White Dwarf, publishing details and a string of exciting and innovative monsters for D&D. So much so, in fact, that when TSR decided to publish their second monster compendium for AD&D, many of them came from contribution to White Dwarf's Fiend Factory. Thus was born the Fiend Folio, featuring such great monsters as the Necrophidius, Needleman, Nilbog, Vault, and many others, and all first featured in White Dwarf. Indeed, 2 monsters have made it all the way to the current 5th edition Monster Manual. The Githyanki by Charles Stross, yes, that Charles Stross, author of the Laundry Files, and the Hook Horror from the Godfather himself, Ian Livingstone. Albie Foray took over the editing duties of Fiend Factory in issue 18, and the great monsters just kept on coming. He introduced the idea in some columns of linking the creatures together with a themed mini-scenario, a nice innovation that provided extra depth and context to the monsters. And so it continued. But how many monsters is too many monsters? At what point does the law of diminishing returns kick in? Maybe it's an argument for a different time, But despite the overall high standard of entries in the Fiend Factory, by the early 60s it did appear to be running out of steam. Indeed, in issue 61, it was announced that monsters would be accepted for any RPG system. Sacrilege. Apparently, this was due to demand. I want names. As it turned out, there was only one non-D&D Fiend Factory column, 69, which featured villains for the Golden Heroes RPG. Maybe that was the final straw, as only 2 more Fiend Factory columns appeared, with the last one in issue 73. But what a glorious run it was. One of the things that made the Fiend Factory such a strong column over the years in White Dwarf was the quality of the artwork that accompanied each entry. They perfectly complemented the imaginative descriptions from the readers and allowed the DMs to easily conjure up in their mind's eye how an encounter with the players would look. Many wonderful artists provided illustrations for the Fiend Factory. Ian McCaig, Kevin Bulmer, John Mould, Alan Hunter, John Blanche all beautifully illustrated the monstrous hordes in their weird and wonderful variety. But for my money, the first among equals was definitely Russ Nicholson. His instantly recognisable style perfectly suited the depiction of monsters. Every creature from his pen was imbued with threat and menace. Just look at his illustration of the Githyanki, also used in the Fiend Folio. The proud, cruel, and malevolent nature of the race are all captured in that picture. I don't know if Russ Nicholson got the Fiend Folio gig on the back of the quality of his illustrations in White Dwarf, but it wouldn't surprise me. While he went on to bigger fame as the illustrator of many classic fighting fantasy game books, for me he will always be the quintessential Fiend Factory artist. So, anyway, in true Top of the Pop style, I thought I'd pick my top 5 monsters from White Dwarf. I made the arbitrary decision that I'd ignore those that featured in the Fiend Folio, since they're likely well known already. On with the top 5. There's actually 6. I'm sorry I couldn't narrow it down any further. Number 6. The Russian Doll Monster. The early Fiend Factory columns featured a number of joke monsters based around a silly idea that might have made you smile, but also made you wonder how to use them in a game, such as the Darty, a mutated mummy. Badum-tsh. Walking just on the right side of absurdity, though, was the Russian Doll Monster by Mike Ferguson in issue 15. The party steel themselves to attack a stone giant. Nervous glances pass between the fighters. The magic user curses the fact that he's just used up his last reduced spell. Just as they start to do some damage, the skin of the stone giant crumples away, and a hill giant emerges from within. More damage, and the hill giant collapses as an ogre emerges. On the process goes down through a succession of humanoids until the party are left facing a kobold. Feeling confident now, they attack the kobold with ease. As it dies, a leprechaun shoots out of the remains, steals the nearest valuable item, and legs it. It's a funny concept, and well realised, and has real impact for the first time the players encounter one. Crucially though, I think this novelty monster you can use more than once, even when the players know it's coming. It's still a heck of a job catching that damn leprechaun. Number 5. Winter Kobolds. The Fiend Factory in issue 26 was subtitled Dire Tribes, and featured monsters that came mob-handed. All the entries are great, but for me the pick of the bunch are the Winter Kobolds by Jonathan Hardwick. Proof that you can make an effective and challenging new monster just by putting a spin on an existing one. Winter Kobolds are a more powerful version of their normal cousins. Toughened by their harsh life in the cold northern wastes, insert your own Bolton joke here, they are described as desperate raiders, attacking homesteads in the dead of night, intent on pillage and slaughter. Jonathan Hardwick put some thought into building a narrative around his monsters, making them an excellent adversary in a campaign based in wintry lands. Another reason the Winter Kobolds appealed to me so much is the superlative illustration by Ian McCaig that accompanies the entry. Drawn side-on, the Winter Kobolds emerge from a snowy tree line. Wrapped in studded leather and furs, they stare into the middle distance, bristling with menace. I don't know what they're looking at, but I don't fancy its chances. Number 4, the Sand Sniper. My favourite monster from the later Fiend Factory columns is undoubtedly the Sand Sniper by Kevin Reedman from issue 64. Whenever my players are anywhere sandy, deserts, dunes, heck, even sandy soil, they learn to be wary of sand snipers. This hidden octopoid nightmare is a great monster for creating drama. As the players plod along on a nondescript journey, there's an instant injection of adrenaline as a tentacle suddenly erupts from the sand and tries to drag a player down below into the waiting, slathering maw. Panic often ensues. Basically, it's Tremors with tentacles. And who doesn't love tentacles? It's also a monster with a well-developed sense of self-preservation. When threatened, it doesn't hang around to be sword fodder, but it burrows back down out of sight, biding its time to strike again. A thoroughly nasty beast. Number 3, the Loculi. In issue 36 of White Dwarf, the Fiend Factory was given over to just one monster, the Loculi. With the luxury of a whole 2 pages to himself, Eric Hall details an intelligent reptilian race rooted deep underground. Large and well-armoured, they're nevertheless agile in their subterranean environment due to their 6-limbed nature. PCs take on the Loculi at their peril. Claws, bite, a fearful club tail, weapons, and all can be used in combat. Older individuals also have spells and psionic abilities available to them. Tolerant of many races with whom they will sometimes trade, they have a deep-seated hatred for dwarves and gnomes, who they will attack without mercy. What sets this Fiend Factory entry apart for me is the well-developed community and social structure that Eric Hall describes. This really provides a great background and context for the Loculi, giving the Dungeon Master a number of great narrative hooks to allow them to be introduced into a campaign. I hope D&D diehards won't be offended when I say that, with its rich group structures and hierarchies, its complex and believable motivations, the Loculi seem more like a RuneQuest monster to me. And I must also mention John Blanche's illustration. A single Loculi waits, tail raised threateningly, holding a scimitar with the notches on the weapon indicating past battles, past victories. Simply spectacular. Number 2. Fairy Denizens. Okay, so this is a bit of a cheat. My second place choice is the whole Fiend Factory column. In issue 38, Alan E. Paul detailed a number of inhabitants of the land of Faerie. Drawing on the Celtic myths of Wales, Scotland, Cornwall and Ireland, he presents a group of creatures that work much better as a single whole rather than individually. The Fairy Denizens are a capricious bunch, at times magical and enchanted, curious about the ways of mortals, and at other times devious objects of pure terror, a threat to your very soul. They are remote and primal, quite distinct from the real world. They bring to mind the dank, misty marshlands of ancient Britain, and the chilling terrors of Arthur Machen's The White People. Inspired by Alan E. Paul's article in the previous issue, about adventuring in the land of fairy, I use the setting a number of times with my players. The denizens are a key part to creating the distinctive atmosphere where mystery and myth combine to create a place out of time where magic can enchant and delight, but danger constantly lurks. And Dungeon Masters, if you have a player who always plays a bard, make sure you introduce them to Li Nan Sidi, also known as the Fey Sturge, whose beautiful but deadly vampiric entities can hide in mirrors, waiting to ensnare their favourite prey, musicians. And number 1 is, in White Dwarf issue 16, one of my favourite RPG writers, combined with one of my favourite artists, to bring to the tabletop a creature from the pages of one of my favourite authors. How could my number 1 monster be anything other than the Urviles? Lou Pulsifer expertly translates these ebony, sightless, alien creatures from the Thomas Covenant stories of Stephen Donaldson into D&D. They're not born, but they're made, spawned in vats. Russ Nicholson's marvellous illustration depicts a bizarre, bestial creature, tensed for action. I think Lou Pulsifer must have written this article after the publication of the first trilogy. Now, those of you who've read the more recent stories, what do you mean you haven't read all 10 books? Will know that the Urvile's motivations become more complex and ambiguous over time, but here they are pure evil. Individually not very dangerous, the power of the Urviles comes from when they form. The Wedge, channeling arcane magic through the Lore Master at the apex. As described by Donaldson, the Lore Master's weapons spat acrid theurgy and ruin as the creatures rushed forward. In game terms, the Lore Master draws power from the Wedge to increase their attacks and improve their armour class. They can produce strong acid from their staff and establish a force field to protect the whole Wedge. It all adds up to a highly distinctive, evocative creature to add to your game. As Louis Pulsifer said recently on Twitter, one of my favourites, a small castle surrounded by assaulting Urviles, terrifying for defenders. Hellfire, what a monster! So, there you have it, some of my favourite fiends from the pages of White Dwarf. With so many greats to choose from, though, I'm sure you'll have your own favourites. Let us know yours via the Armchair Adventurers blog page at thegrognardfiles.com. Monster mark calculation is not required.
Games Master screen.
Once again, we've left our normal room of role-playing rambling and we've gone down into the darkest depths of Dirk Towers to find my trapped menagerie, a menagerie of monsters. I like doing that evil laugh.
That's your evil laugh.
Is it?
Okay.
I'm not particularly evil.
No. Well, we'll find out in a minute, won't we?
Okay, this is a part of the podcast called the Games Master screen. So, without further ado, I'm going to install the screen between myself and Blythy. Hello, Blythy.
Hello,
by the way.
Dirk.
And we're going to use a random table. Because this episode is all about the monster manual, we have 2 tables of wandering monsters, random encounter tables. Have you got enough on there?
I think there's enough, yeah.
Did you feel it okay?
Yeah, well, I struggled a little bit. How can I put it? I think the monsters are all good in certain contexts. So there's certain monsters that work very well when you pit them against particular character classes or particular parties or particular players with a certain attitude. So they all have the unique sort of special attacks and special ways of dealing with things.
Yeah.
And I think D&D sometimes struggles for the great all-round monster because they all fit into a certain context and are good in a certain way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no.
So it's difficult to pick a good all-rounders.
Well, I had no trouble filling mine because, last time you said spells are where D&D comes into its own. And for me, it's the monsters where D&D comes into its own. And, my reflections over the last few years since we've got back into the hobby, I've listened to lots of podcasts, and there is a silence over monsters. It's a subject that nobody wants to deal with. If you want to listen to podcasts about, plot points and the story development, there's loads out there. If you want to deal with idiot holes at the table and, people who hog the snacks, you can find loads of podcasts about that. But you can't find podcasts about monsters.
Yeah, that's a good point, that, isn't it? I wonder why that is.
Well, the reason I started in the hobby, and I started this episode to do with the Golden Voyage of Sinbad. As a kid, I loved seeing monsters larger than life on the screen.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I started doing it. I started role-playing. Not because I could decide my own story. I wanted to encounter monsters and hit them with a sword. Yeah,
I know what you mean, and I wonder if that's why people don't talk about monsters in as much detail. Because is it a kind of a bit of a dirty word, like the fact that we like monsters, we like hitting things with swords until they're dead. Is it perceived as a bit crude? Is it the crude end of the game? So if you've got your player characters with their fleshed out backgrounds and interactions with other player characters and storylines, and you've got your intricate scenario with all the different bits and pieces, and then you encounter some goblin bandits, and you have a good old scrap with the goblin bandits, and you kill them all. Is it sort of feel a bit incidental to the overarching plot, or is it just that we quite enjoy that? We quite enjoy fighting goblin bandits, but we don't really want to talk about it because it's like the crude end of the game. So it's a little bit when you tell someone who doesn't play role-playing games, often I find one of the reactions of people who know nothing about it, or they have a rudimentary understanding of it. So if you play Dungeons and Dragons, do you? And you say, yeah. They go, oh, is that like killing dragons and monsters in a dungeon? That's their perception of it, and I think that's why perhaps.
No, it's not about that.
It's not about that. It's about story arc and plot. It is about that. It is about that. It's about killing things, essentially. And there is that. I think there is that sense in which it perhaps feels a bit crude.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's part of it. Certainly. But I also think it's a case of familiarity breeds contempt. Because it is such an important part of the game that. Around the table, everybody's like, and this is where the monster manual comes in, because it's kind of ingrained, and you saying that certain things fit certain things, and they have like a mathematical equation to deal with certain situations.
Yes.
That it loses some of its essential magic.
Yeah. Possibly. Yeah. I think as we're saying at this point, we've read 5th edition. I think 5th edition monster manual is a world away from 1st edition. It's fantastic menagerie. It's much better set of monsters. I think you're right. 1st edition D&D, it does feel like that kind of mathematical thing of, if you've got characters like this, you can throw this at them. If you've got a character like that, you can throw this at them.
You're absolutely right. I think of the 3 books that have come out for the 5th edition, I could spend hours reading the monster manual. I have spent hours.
Yes, we both have. Yeah,
it's. I find it very inspiring. It's got lots of little details in there about the story. And when you think of many of these monsters started as little plastic figures, didn't they? So like the Boule.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So Gary Gygax had a collection of from the pound shop, the little made in Taiwan figures. That's where the rust monster comes from, doesn't it? With
weird little plastic figure.
The owl bear and the Boule, of course. And you look at the Boule in the 1st edition, the drawing of it, and it looks ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yeah, even though it ate at your dwarven pony.
Yeah, that wasn't allowed to have. But that idea of it being a land shark and everything, it should be fearsome. And the 5th edition does make it fearsome.
Yes, it does. Yeah, the illustration's better, and some of the I think some of the background too. So, for example, some of the more pedestrian monsters in 5th edition are far more exciting in 5th edition. So orcs and zombies, for example, which are kind of your stock in trade monsters, have some kind of special abilities that make them slightly more fearsome. It's like, I think the zombies, they don't necessarily die when they die again when they get to 0 hit points. They get certain saving throws because they're already dead, and that kind of thing, that make them a little bit more exciting. Because I think Monster Manual, 1st edition Monster Manual, does have quite a few run-of-the-mill, bog-standard, goblins, hobgoblins, gnolls, lizard men. They're all the same, really, aren't they? They don't really have much to them, apart from, they're just a different thing. But a hobgoblin, gets a little bit more on its hit dice, and an orc. But essentially, same kind of monsters. 5th edition makes them much more well-rounded. It's like the goblins that we encountered when we first played 5th edition could sort of hide as an extra action, so they were kind of darting in and out of the woods, the forest, and you couldn't see them, and that made them difficult and a bit more fearsome, even though they're kind of puny. 1 minute they've shot an arrow at you, and when it's your turn, they've disappeared into the forest. And that's kind of exciting and makes them more exciting. Yeah,
absolutely. But the third thing, I blame Peter Jackson and CGI.
Yes.
Because when Peter Jackson had the toolkit to create monsters, even though he had he looked back to Ray Harryhausen, you only have to look at something like King Kong to realise that the greatest monster in cinema history, King Kong, diminished to a video game. CGI, it doesn't have any weight. It doesn't have any sense of being gigantic. That's diminished.
Yeah, that's true. I think you've hit on something there, because you sit there and you think, well, it's a computer. How do they do that? Oh, it's a computer.
Yeah.
And it loses something a little bit. Whereas when it was the Ray Harryhausen stuff, how do they do that? Oh, it's a little model, and you move it bit by bit, and then it looks like a real thing. And there's something, I don't know, in the back of your mind, there's something sort of more. You're right, it has more weight, has a little bit more weight. Whereas CGI stuff, if you say it was just a computer, well, it's just a computer, isn't it? You can do anything with a computer, almost anything visually, and therefore, as you say, it feels more like a video game. Or maybe just take them for granted.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the thing. CGI, we take monsters for granted because Ray Harryhausen's skeletons at the end of Jason and the Argonauts, right?
Yeah.
That's a great scene. And they're the little models and made to look big and they move stop motion and all that. If that was redone now, I will bet you anything you like, it would be a horde of skeletons, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
It would be an absolute...
They do it now,
It would be an army of skeletons. And the problem with that, I think you're right, it takes something away from it. So you sit there and you get me blasé. Oh, there's 1,000 skeletons, is there? How do they do that? Oh, it's a computer.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the stop motion stuff.
I go back to King Kong. When Willis O'Brien originally did that, the ape, even in those crude effects, the ape had significance and weight. Peter Jackson has it cartwheeling over a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yeah. So I think you're right. Culturally, if you're into those kind of films, and that kind of stuff, you're probably into role playing. So maybe there is some kind of connection that we've all got too accustomed to monsters. You sit in your cinema seat saying, "Go on, impress me with a monster," and it is difficult to do now because it's just a computerized thing.
Yeah. And I think that is reflected when you get around the table.
Yes.
If anything, I would like us all to go back. And I think it was at Daily Dwarf in his articles mentioned an article at Gamesmanship by Martin Heitch from issue 75. And he says in there about going back and feeling that sense of that first game that you had. And that first game was the thrill of being in the room with a goblin.
Yes, fighting a monster.
An orc.
Yeah.
And that thrill of
the thrill of it was that you felt like Jason and his Argonauts fighting the skeletons. Yeah. And now for a lot of seasoned role players, fighting a few skeletons would just feel like, an incidental thing in the game.
Yeah.
Where's the necromancer? We're fighting his skeletons, but where's the evil necromancer?
Yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's about wanting to get back to that kind of thing. Maybe we should start some kind of pressure group, support your local monster.
Yeah.
Monster Week.
Yeah.
Monster Day, National Monster Day, National RPG Monster Day.
Yeah.
Where you play role playing and you just throw monsters at people. Have no plot, no character background, absolutely nothing. You just have a series of rooms with horrible monsters in you have to fight.
And don't get me wrong, I think as we look at these at our Wandering Monster tables, you can integrate monsters into the plot. They do have an important role in the story. That's not what I'm particularly saying, really. It's more to do with we've lost the sense that isn't it great? Isn't it great?
What a great game. What's great about this game? Yeah, one of the things that's great. There's many things that are great about it, and yes, plot and story and character are all important. But you're right. Yeah, fighting monsters is a great part of it as well. It's just as great as all the other bits.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
And I think with the new monster manual for 5th edition, it really lets you do that. I think it's a good springboard. So, yeah, I think D&D with the monsters is where it comes into its own. Okay. So let's have a look at these.
Who's going first, me or you?
I'll let you go first.
Me? All right, okay. All right.
Okay.
To 3.
Okay.
My first monster is a lowly creature, really. It might surprise people less. It's the lowly kobold.
Right. Okay.
Often much mocked, much maligned for being an incredibly puny opponent with I think it only gets like 1d4 hit points, doesn't it? It's half a hit dice. It's not even a full hit dice, like a goblin or an orc. Many a high-level character's career is founded on the blood of kobolds, isn't it? Because when you're a first level, when you've got a first level party, it's quite tricky to find monsters to fight because they're puny, aren't they? I mean, first level characters in first edition D&D. Again, less so in 5th edition. But in first edition D&D, if you play it as it's meant to be played, and you don't say, "Oh well, at first level I'll give you maximum hit points. I'll give the fighter 10 hit points. You can have a maximum." If you roll D10, if you fight against 6 hit points or 5 hit points, or not, your average orc or goblin against a first level fighter, it's sort of 50-50 that the fighter might die. The beauty of the kobold is they can pose a bit of a threat, but they're puny enough for first level characters. They're weak enough to put against first level characters, and whilst they will give a sense of threat, because they can kill you, they can win, they can do damage, and you miss them and they hit you and all that. But there's a sense in which a first level character can kind of fight kobolds and win, but at the same time, kobolds sort of interesting little tribal units of kobolds. They're not, a rabid dog or a wolf. I can remember once reading in White Dwarf. I don't know who it was, but it was some comment that said, a couple of rabid dogs can pose a big threat for first level characters. And I think that's true, but it's sort of boring, isn't it? Because you think, well, like you say, you want to fight monsters. If you're a first level party, you want to fight monsters. Yeah. And kobolds are monsters.
Yes.
They're monsters.
What I like about kobolds, there's a couple of things. First of all, going back to what I was saying last time, about being pragmatically minded, being practically minded. You need kobolds around to keep the place tidy, because that's the original thing, isn't it? That they were kind of
the job's tidy up,
clear up out of a dungeon, just like sweep it. The janitors of the monsters world.
Yeah, and also the sword fodder, and janitors of the fantasy world.
But also, for some period in the 80s, I was a kobold. I took on the persona of a kobold when I was running a postal game. And you
did, that's right, I remember now.
The fanzine I had at the time was called the National Kobold, because it was the time of the miners' strike.
Yeah, the National Kobold. Yeah.
But I think the kobold is a good thing. So let's see what I'm going to pit it against. Okay.
Well, whatever you pit it against is going to be tougher, isn't it? Because it's unless it's a rabid dog, which case the kobold might have a chance.
Let's roll on this then. I've got 5, and I've got an imp.
An imp. Okay.
Okay.
We're for small monsters, aren't we?
We are, yeah. Start off small and we'll build up. I think that's the idea, isn't it? It's only 2 foot high. An imp can shred a party.
Yes, I think I've seen this done.
I know.
I think I was in that party.
You see, I was saying earlier about Peter Jackson. I don't want to disparage his films too much, but because there's some great ones there. I'm not saying that, but when it comes to monsters, I believe as a dungeon master, you should direct your monsters like Steven Spielberg directs his monsters, right? Because I like the sense of horror and terror that monster and a monster encounters.
Yes.
So I always tend to make the players aware what they could be up against. And I think I presented it to you, wasn't it, that this wizard that you were going to encounter had an imp as a familiar.
Yeah, so before you get in there that you're in potential trouble.
Yes, yeah. And the thing with an imp, it has lots of abilities that can make things interesting.
Yeah.
So it can shape change. So it's got a few things it can shape change into. Rats being one of them. So it can arrive in a pack of rats.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and presumably if there are rats in a dungeon anyway, you could argue you wouldn't even notice it's arrived.
No.
Because there's just rats around.
Yeah. And it can turn invisible. So you can have lots of fun taking things, stealing things. And it also has the ability of suggestion. It can whisper into players' ears. Things that they may not want to do. 2 foot high. This imp.
Yes.
And I suppose the most deadly thing is its tail. So you've got to save versus death with its tail. You get hit by its tail. So I think there's a lot of fun to be had having the kind of the swarthy paladin and his entourage up against an imp.
One imp can cause so much mayhem. Yeah.
But I think that's a thing. It gives you those special abilities give you the chance to create a bit of suspense. Is it here? Yeah. Is it this pack of rats? Is it in this pack of rats?
Yeah, we know it's around. Yeah.
Yeah.
We know it's around, and so it engenders a kind of sense of fear and paranoia almost. Yeah. Which is what good monsters sort of should do in a way. It's always good, that sense of in these catacombs or in this temple or wherever there is such a thing, waiting potentially to kind of, and it worries players and gets them on edge. Whereas just revealing it, just opening the door and revealing a monster, you don't get quite the same fear because at that point they've got to deal with it.
I always think that a monster like that is wasted if it's revealed.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it should torment beforehand or give evidence of it. It's the old, I don't know what's on your table, but it's the old statues without a plinth thing, isn't it? It sharpens the mind, doesn't it?
Sharpens the mind, yeah. Or there's a Medusa or a Gorgon or something in here. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we started small. Let's see if we get any bigger.
Well, I'm pleased that we've picked monsters. I was a little bit worried. I mean, I don't know what else is on your table. I was a little bit worried we were going to get giant things. I have strong feelings about giant things in Monster Manual. I really do. I don't like it. Giant weasel. Yeah. There's giant badgers. There's badgers. There's badgers in the Monster Manual, and yet there's a little footnote that says they can come in giant forms. And you think, why bother with that? If you put giant badger on your list, I suggest you cross it off now. Yeah, because you'll get short shrift from me.
Just get me pen.
It's called Dungeons and Dragons, isn't it? Not Dungeons and Giant Badgers.
Giant shrew.
Right, shrew.
Coming off.
Giant shrew. Giant weasel. Giant this. Giant that. I mean, you're a giant spider. I'll give you that, but just putting giant in front of ordinary animals. There's a lot of that in Monster Manual.
Yeah,
it does irritate me.
There is some of that, and I think in some of the further versions it gets a bit worse, doesn't it?
I think Monster Manual 2 has even more stupid thing. Giant antelope. When will you need one of those? What point?
You can always tell in a bistro when they're running out of ideas, when things just start getting big.
Things just get big, or
giant, like geometrical shapes.
Yeah, I think there's some of those in Monster Manual 2, isn't there? Anyway, we won't go there. We won't go there. So no giant things. So I'm not playing.
2 small things. Let's see what you've got.
It's an 8.
An 8.
An 8. Right, okay. Right, well, my next choice is... it's slightly conventional, I think, but I have my reasons. It's The Vampire.
The Vampire.
The Vampire.
Can't do me evil laugh again.
Well, have you done one more? Have you done already? You know, that was your evil laugh. Well, that's your evil laugh. Oh, no, that was it before. Not that, the one before. Your normal laugh.
That's my evil
your
chuckle.
The reason I picked The Vampire is... There's a couple of reasons. One ties back into what we were talking about earlier, in that one of the problems with Monster Manual is that a lot of the monsters are just things to defeat. But the vampire, for whatever reason, often has the kind of capacity to be an NPC villain, if you like, or an arch nemesis, that kind of thing. And I know in the past we've used them in that way. And certainly, you know, Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft and all those kind of scenarios tie into that idea that I think of all the monsters in Monster Manual, Vampire is the one that you think as a games master, you know, this isn't just a monster that you'll find in a room somewhere and have to defeat. It's a monster that is like a person.
It's a monster with personality.
It's got personality, you know, whether that comes from Monster Manual or whether it just comes from culture generally, I don't know. But it's got that kind of personality that you can use it as a major villain in a scenario. And a lot of the monsters in Monster Manual don't really have that capacity, I don't think. So that's one reason. I think the other reason is, again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, a bit like movies from childhood and books from childhood and all that kind of stuff. You know, watching Hammer horror films on a Saturday night when you're sort of 12 years old. The vampire in Monster Manual is a very good translation of the creature from films and books into game terms. What I mean by that is there's lots of monsters in Monster Manual that are from mythology, but when you read them, they're often twisted a little bit. They're often skewed a little bit to fit the game. But when you read the vampire description, it is, you know, Christopher Lee, isn't it? In the vampire, in those Hammer horror films, it is that, and again, there's that magic.
See, I think the vampire has suffered over the last 20 years or so from its proliferation.
Well, that's true, and I think that's true. It's everywhere. The vampire's everywhere. But what I'm trying to say is, you've got to contextualise it a bit. Monster Manual. When Monster Manual was published, there was no Knights Black Agents. There was no Call of Cthulhu. There was none of these other games.
Masquerade.
Yeah, there's none of that. And what they did, they took that thing that scared you on the telly as a kid and made it playable in a game.
It is a Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee vampire that it creates.
Yeah.
And I think as well that thing that it has, and I know that we have different opinions on this, I think it's one of those monsters that sharpens the minds of the players.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the level draining ability.
Oh yeah.
Is that, you know, you might have 110 hit points. Doesn't matter.
No, because it's going to drain levels.
You're going to drain levels.
I mean, I always have mixed feelings about a level drain. Monsters that can do level. I don't mind the draining of levels on player characters. I think that's a good. Like you say, it's a good thing because it's a scary thing. But I think when we've played it, we've always said, you know, a week's rest and you start getting the levels back. Because I think to actually drain 2, 3, 4 levels out of someone's a bit mean, given that it takes you that long to get up the levels.
See, I don't have any.
You don't have a problem with that, do you? But I think when I've had vampires in my games, I've always said, it drains your levels, but a day's full rest, you get a level back. You know, it seems less. It still makes the monster deadly, because in that moment in time, it can drain your levels and kill you pretty quickly. But it's not as long term, the effects of it.
The vampires in 5th edition are a bit more prosaic to reflect how vampires have changed in literature and cinema over the intervening years. Yeah. But I think you're right. I think there's something about that vampire that, as it appears in Monster Manual and I think, the 1st edition,
I think as well
really
what's good about them, because there are other undead creatures like liches and, you know, wights and that kind of thing. But good thing about the vampire is because it draws from mythology and films. You've got all those ways of it is very dangerous. But you've all those unusual ways of killing it. So it disintegrates in sunlight, can't pass running water. So it gives the players a kind of space where they can think, look, this monster's really dangerous, but he has these weaknesses. He has these strange weaknesses. So if we're on the other side of a river, he can't cross it. That kind of stuff, that's all in there, which makes him sort of the king of the undead as a monster, because he's more interesting than a wight or a lich and all that kind of stuff, I think.
Yeah. Right, let's see who I'm going to pit against. Almost the king of monsters.
The king of monsters, yeah.
Ha! I raise you, the dragon.
Oh, typical. You're always looking at the wandering monsters. The dragon. It has to appear, doesn't it?
It has to appear.
Yeah.
It has to appear.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it is Dungeons and Dragons after all.
Not Dungeons and Giant Badgers.
Yeah.
No.
And I come back to that thing of how dragons have been particularly badly treated by CGI and over familiarity. I mean, you only have to look at the Game of Thrones dragons, and they don't do them well, do they?
No.
I think an encounter with a dragon needs to be significant and interesting, and I think the selection dragons that they give you in Dungeons and Dragons do give you that ability as a dungeon master to create that. And also I think there's that thing of knowing what you're going to encounter, going back to the imp, but more so with the dragon, knowing what you're going to encounter allows you to kind of equip yourself to take on that, like a vampire, start sharpening the stakes. And some of the dragons having strategies, the players thinking about developing strategies for the encounter and how to subdue, because you have those rules on how to subdue.
Yeah, some of the rules around them are interesting, aren't they?
Yeah. So I do think that. I think there's nothing better as a player when you get into that room and you're in the room with the dragon. To me, that is the most thrilling encounter you can have in role-playing games.
Yeah, that's true. And as you say, they're interesting monsters from a sort of game perspective as well, because you can have like young dragons, can't you, and older dragons. And again, goes back to what I was saying about the kobold in a roundabout way, in that when you've got low-level characters, or lowish level, I mean, obviously you wouldn't put first-level characters against a dragon, but when you've got lowish level characters, you can still use dragons to make it interesting, because if you pick a young dragon that's not as powerful as an older dragon, you can still incorporate them into your game.
Yes.
And that's a good thing, because sometimes some of the really spectacular, the demons and devils and all that kind of stuff that are incredibly powerful and spectacular, you just can't use them unless your players are very, very high level. But the dragon, you can use it relatively early on in a game by just making it a younger dragon, a weaker dragon. And it's got that kind of sliding scale in there, hasn't it, for it as a monster.
And you can Spielbergify it by tormenting the players with the dragon, because it's got those abilities to do that. Yeah,
to do that. And it's got like intelligence, hasn't it? And that's an interesting thing, isn't it, about Dungeons and Dragons, that again, if you go back to 1979, whenever it's published, in a lot of people's imagination, a dragon is just a big, scary monster that's going to eat you. St. George and the Dragon type thing. Yeah. But Dungeons and Dragons creates these dragons they've got spells, they can speak, they've got intelligence, they've got and they are like fascinatingly versatile monsters, aren't they?
So the vampire versus the dragon.
I have to give you the dragon. I have to concede, won't I? Because you can't say again. It's not Dungeons and Vampires, it's Dungeons and Dragons.
Although there are plenty of vampire games, aren't there?
There are, yeah.
Okay. Over to you to
Next
roll
one.
for your last one.
Okay, last one. 2. Right. Well, it's another tiny monster, and another one that seems, on the face of it, a little bit like your imp, innocuous. It's the sturge. The blood-sucking. I've picked 2 bloodsuckers, haven't I? The vampire and now the sturge. The sturge is a particular favourite of mine because, and again, I've seen this done. It has that ability to really kind of rattle players, even when they think they're kind of powerful, by the fact that it attacks. Although it's kind of puny and little, it attacks, I think, as a 4-hit dice monster. So it's a lot tougher in terms of its attack than its actual hit points. And once it attaches to you, it starts to drain hit points, and you've got to kill it to get it off. Now, if you have a swarm of sturges, what is a swarm? A flock?
I don't know.
A flock?
A murder.
A murder of sturges would have to be, wouldn't it? that can cause real problems. And I've seen that done with a party. Again, a kind of cocky party that thinks they're, we're 4th, 5th level, and we're a bit tough now. And these little sturges appear, and people think that's not a problem, is it? Whack one of these, and it's dead with one hit. But then, of course, a few more appear, a few get attached. 2 of them get attached to a player character. You can only kill one in a round.
Yeah.
And by the time he's killed one, another one can be attached. And all the time, they're draining hit points. So it's that thing of, as I was saying earlier, I found it difficult to get a good all-round monster that has a special attack that's kind of universally good, universally effective. But I do think the Sturge is kind of getting there. It's an interesting monster. It has a special attack, and it's kind of all-purpose. You can use it against anyone, anytime, and it's guaranteed to put the wind up them.
Yeah, as a dungeon master, I think the Sturge is a dungeon master's friend, because you can put them in a room where there's another encounter taking place, another thing to deal with, and the Sturges can be just a nuisance.
Yeah, the Sturges just live in the ceiling, in the rafters of the wherever it is. So,
So whilst you're kind of turning zombies or trying to deal with something else, these pesky Sturges are kind of draining away at you and having to deal with
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good choice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see what else is on my table. Okay, 1. Now, in the ecology of the dungeon, there are certain creatures, aren't there, that exist only because of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, they do. Yes.
And I'm not going to reveal this, because this isn't a creature that you reveal easy, is it? On my table. Don't be looking.
I don't know. You've not revealed it yet.
But yeah, in the ecology of the dungeon, so these creatures that exist only because of Dungeons and Dragons, they wouldn't exist because of anything else. So previously we've mentioned the ones that are based on plastic figures that Gary Gygax bought from the pound shop, stroke dime store.
Dime store, yes.
from Taiwan. But there are also those creatures that exist just to, as I said, torment players. The mimic that looks like a chest.
Yeah. I have a dim view of those sometimes, but there we go.
See, I like them. I
think there's a fine line, though, isn't there? Sometimes, I suppose, between the daft monster,
But
the mimic. I mean, it only exists so it can look like a treasure chest and then attack someone. You think, oh, come on.
but I see. This is where I've been able to reconcile Dungeons and Dragons. So, in a bit like the character classes in films and in books, you don't have a group of people going around with a cleric,
well-balanced party.
Well-balanced party, do you? In the same way, if you accept that in this game, you will encounter stuff. It's a game, isn't it? It's a game. So,
that's true, and we have had fun in sort of dungeons with monsters that are like that and are just essentially silly but challenging. Yeah.
So I'm going to reveal it now.
Don't reveal it. You're not revealing it yet.
The lurker above.
Thank God for that. Thought you were going to say gelatinous cube. We don't have a fight on your hands then. Stupid monster.
The lurker above. Now, I only like the lurker above because of one reason.
I know that reason. Yeah.
The theme of these series of podcasts have been about the power player, haven't they? And I think monsters are part of the armour in the war of attrition between the dungeon master and the power player.
Yeah.
And as you say, certain things suit in certain situations.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
And we had a problem with a power player, and if that power player, Kevin, was here,
he would remain nameless.
Yeah, Kevin. If he was here, he'd be riding in on a high horse right now. Wouldn't he?
Would, yes. A white charger of a high horse.
Yeah,
it?
for Gondor.
In his paladin armour.
Yeah. Because I need to get it. It puts me in a bad light. This, doesn't it?
You sound like one of those psychopathic games masters.
Yeah, but I'm not like that.
He is a psychopath.
But the lurker above, of course, is a camouflaged giant stingray type creature that can drop from the ceiling of a dungeon and envelop a player and just constrict them until dead.
Yeah.
a great creature. A great creature when you're faced with a power player who just barges into rooms.
Yeah, the kind of power player who barges into rooms feeling invulnerable, feeling that no matter what gets thrown at me, I've got enough hit points to soak it up and worry about it the next round of combat, which is the situation we sometimes found ourselves in.
Yeah. And lurker above it essentially is like a living trap, isn't it? It's like it's just put there to kind of
it drops on you. I don't think you can attack with your weapons either.
No,
can
no.
You? So
no.
You're kind of constrained.
Yeah. It's great. It's great for those.
Calm down.
See, I am putting myself in a bad light because. It is a great creature, and to be fair, I did give clues, didn't I?
You did give clues because the rest of us, I think there were holes in the ceiling. Weren't there? The rest of us decided to not go in, and that irritated him. And he said, "Oh, you cowards!" and walked in.
Yeah,
and
it dropped on him.
Almost died.
Yeah, he almost died. Yeah, so very powerful paladin, and the lurker above enveloped him. And the great thing about it as well is you can't really hit a lurker above without doing damage to the person who's being enveloped. So
that's true. Yeah, if you shove a sword through it, you're going to arguably shove it at least in part through them as well. Yeah.
So endless debate ensued. On that. Yeah. But I think the good thing about it as well is that it can cause surprise, and then you've got a certain length of time because all the great creatures, if you're being Spielberg about it, have suspense, horror, and anticipation, and create a sense of jeopardy. Because that's why I think sometimes lost in the kind of fodder approach of hit dice.
Well, that's it. Because a lurker above it's generally speaking, it's not too slow a death, but it is a relative. It's a slow enough death to make you think, I'm going to die here unless I do something, and I can't do very much. Someone else is going to have to help me.
Yes.
It's got that suspense of, whilst it's not got the suspense that you know it's there, because the whole point is you don't know it's there, but it has got the suspense that once it attacks, you are in trouble. I suppose it's very similar to the Sturge in a way, isn't it?
Yeah.
It has that same feeling of, no one would worry, particularly if a dungeon had some Sturges in. But once they attach themselves to you and they start draining your blood, then you're going to start worrying. So it's a different kind of suspense to the imp and the vampire, or the Medusa, or whatever, because that's suspense based on when's it going to attack.
Yeah.
It's more suspense. It has attacked me, but the way it's killing me is slow, and I'm struggling to do anything about it, and I'm losing hit points hand over fist. So both those monsters do that kind of thing, don't they? In their own way.
And I think it was a reasonable thing to do. I mean, Kevin on his high horse up there probably disagrees.
Well, I think it is reasonable because the problem with the power gamer is that you've got to sort of show them who's boss as a games master, haven't you? Otherwise, they start running the game a little bit.
Yeah, I think the words are politely but firmly.
Politely but firmly tell them this is who the boss is.
I probably overstepped the mark though when I was kissing the dice before I rolled them.
You did kiss the dice. It wasn't that wasn't particularly. That's very nice, was it? Psychopath. Oh dear.
And on that note,
that
bombshell, let's pack up the monster manual. I think we need to come back to monsters for other game systems because we haven't really talked about them, have we?
No, we've not. It seems logical to talk about it for D&D because there are so many monsters. I mean, and it probably has more monsters than any game. Monster Manual, Fiend Folio, Monster Manual 2. So it's more monsters than anything, really.
I think we need to come back to monsters, certainly. And I want to say to our listeners out there, I want you to rediscover and fall in love with the magic of a really good monster.
But not giant badgers.
Yeah,
no giant badgers. You'll not fall in love with those.
No. And try not to kiss the dice.
There isn't another section.
I didn't have the heart to point out that the greatest monster in cinema history is, of course, a giant monkey. I'd be interested in your views and tips for directing monsters. I feel they should never be set dressing. If Call of Cthulhu has taught us gamers anything, is that there's an excitement and thrill anticipating monsters if they're handled correctly and treated with care and reverence they deserve. Let me know your thoughts on Twitter at the Grognard File, my favourite social media channel, where you'll also find at Daily Dwarf. At Daily Dwarf and Blythy are having a well-earned break next time. The fourth and final part of this epic Dungeons and Dragons episode is going to be like the footnotes, the Silmarillion, or the Unearthed Arcana. Chris Watkins from Bonhomie Games complained that I didn't include the potted history of D&D to provide some context. Unfortunately, it ended up on the cutting room floor to try and reduce the size of the Dungeon Master's Guide in part 1. I'm going to stick it in the next part, along with an interview I did with Rick and Tim from the Old Scroats Club in Southport. They've had some great experience of playing that they've shared with me. It includes RuneQuest and D&D. Tim talks about how the different editions of D&D evolved. Also in the next part, there'll be an extended postbag. On the website, there's been some interesting comments at thegrognardfiles.com. On the site, you'll find the details of our other projects, including a fanzine, a meet-up in Manchester, an online game and other things that we're doing. All of these projects have been made possible with the support and encouragement of our patrons. If you like what we do, then please support us by throwing some coins in the beret Patreon site. At this point of the podcast, I'd like to say thank you for those patrons that have joined us this time round. First off, Frank Turfler, Jason Beaumont and Adam Buxton, not that one, and Bill Foreman are now honorary members of the Armchair Adventurers Club, and they'll get a PDF copy of the fanzine when it comes out. Coming in at the $3.50 a month level is Richard August and James Rogers. Thanks, guys. They'll get a hard copy of the fanzine when it comes out. Well, thanks to you all. We also have some new $5 a month backers, and I always try to give them a virtual gift at random from a table from the game under the discussion. And this time I'm going back to the second edition Dungeon Master's Guide and rolling on a magical items table. This time it's table 19, rods. Okay, first up it's Joe and Chris Watkins, long-term supporters of the Grognard Files, and they're the proprietors of bonhomiegames.uk, the home of convivial gaming. Check out their store online, and let's have a see. They get a 19, and that's a rod of terror. I suppose that's like the equivalent of Rod Hull and Emu. Okay, thanks guys. Okay, next is Richard Scott of otherworldminiatures.co.uk, and he's written some great comments about the podcast on the site. Thanks, Richard. You need to check out his site, if only to see the impressive demon idol based on the first edition player handbook illustration. It's fantastic. Okay, here goes. That's a natural 20, which means I get to pick one. So I'm going to give you a Rod of Singing. It's a sort of magical Rod Stewart. And Rod Stewart looks like he's been hit in the face with a rod, doesn't he? Last and definitely not least is Jeff Bernstein. He's upgraded his pledge this month, so thank you very much. And you get a 12. That's the Rod of Rulership. So it's one rod to rule them all. Thanks a lot. Okay, please do keep in touch, and next time will be the episode's footnotes. But don't tell Peter Jackson, for goodness sake. He'll want to create an epic out of it, and we're quite capable of doing that ourselves. So until next time, I'm dirkthedice@gmail.com. Adios, amigos.